Hey everyone, Dave here. Welcome to my little corner of YouTube where we dive into awesome audiobooks. I'm all about sharing stories from big-name authors you love, but also some hidden treasures, including a few of my own, if you're curious. Look, I'm always on the hunt for the next great listen, so if you've got a book you're dying to hear, drop it in the comments. Who knows? You might hear it here soon. Oh, and if you're enjoying what you hear, why not hit that subscribe button? It helps more than you know. All right, let's get into today's story.
The Terrifier 2. Chapter 1. Resurrection. The fluorescent lights of Miles County Morgue flickered, casting intermittent shadows across the sterile tile floor. It was well past midnight, and medical examiner Jeff Davidson was finishing up his paperwork on what had been, until now, an unremarkable shift. The events of last year's Halloween massacre had finally begun to fade from the town's collective memory, or so they thought. The body bag in the corner wasn't supposed to move. At first, Jeff dismissed it as exhaustion playing tricks on his eyes. But then came the sound, a low rustling, followed by something that might have been a giggle. His pen clattered to the desk. "Hello?" His voice echoed off the cold walls. Standing slowly, he approached the body bag, telling himself this was just another late-night false alarm. He'd had plenty since they'd brought in the clown's corpse last year. The zipper of the body bag jerked downward an inch, then another. Jeff froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. A white-gloved hand emerged from the opening, its fingers waggling in a playful greeting that made his blood run cold. In one fluid motion, the zipper split open completely, and Art the Clown sat up, his black and white face paint somehow immaculate despite his year-long death. His yellow-stained teeth stretched into that familiar, terrible grin. Jeff stumbled backward, knocking over a tray of instruments that clattered across the floor. "You're dead," he stammered. "We confirmed it. Multiple gunshot wounds, complete cardiac failure." Art tilted his head at an impossible angle, that grin never wavering. He reached into the body bag and withdrew a scalpel that hadn't been there before. With exaggerated movements, he pressed a finger to his lips in a shushing gesture, then pointed to a sign on the wall that read, "Quiet, please. Morgue." Across town, 16-year-old Sienna Shaw jolted awake in her bed, a scream dying in her throat. Her hands clutched at her sheets, soaked with cold sweat. The nightmare had felt so real. A twisted circus tent, a laughing clown, and her father's voice warning her about something she couldn't quite remember. Her bedroom window was open, though she was certain she'd closed it before bed. A cool October breeze carried the scent of autumn leaves and, very faintly, grease paint. On her desk, her father's final gift to her, a warrior girl costume he'd designed before his death, seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. In the distance, sirens began to wail. At the morgue, Jeff Davidson's body wouldn't be discovered until morning's shift change. The scene would baffle investigators, not because of the creative brutality of the murder, but because of what was written on the wall in the victim's blood. "Just getting started." Below the message, a crude drawing of a smiling clown face dripped down the tiles, and in the corner of the room the body bag lay empty, save for a single rubber chicken. Its head twisted completely backward. Sienna's alarm clock read 3:33 a.m. when she finally managed to slow her breathing. She told herself it was just another nightmare, even as her father's words from the dream echoed in her mind. "He's coming back, sweetie, and this time, he's coming for you." She reached for her phone to text her best friend Allie, needing someone to talk to, when she noticed something that made her blood freeze. There on her desk, next to the warrior costume, sat a single piece of hard candy wrapped in black and white striped paper. It hadn't been there when she went to bed. Somewhere in the darkness of Miles County, a clown's silent laughter echoed through the streets, heralding the beginning of a Halloween that would never be forgotten. Chapter 2. The Halloween Dream. Morning light filtered through Sienna's bedroom window, doing little to dispel the unease from her restless night. The black and white striped candy was still there, a silent reminder that perhaps her nightmare hadn't been just a dream. She picked it up gingerly between two fingers and dropped it into her wastebasket, trying to ignore how her hand trembled. Sienna? Jonathan? Breakfast? Her mother Barbara's voice carried up the stairs, normal and reassuring in its everyday irritation. Pulling on her worn Led Zeppelin t-shirt, Sienna paused at her dresser mirror. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, testament to weeks of interrupted sleep. The warrior girl costume her father had designed caught her reflection. Intricate leather work and carefully crafted armor panels that seemed to shimmer with an almost otherworldly quality in the morning light. "Coming, Mom," she called back, but her eyes remained fixed on the costume. In her dream, her father had been working on it in his studio, his hands moving with urgent purpose as he spoke. "It's not just a costume, honey, it's protection. You'll understand when the time comes." The smell of burnt toast broke through her reverie. Downstairs, she found her younger brother Jonathan already at the kitchen table, hunched over his phone, watching what appeared to be crime scene footage. "Jonathan," Barbara snatched the phone away. "What have I told you about watching that stuff at breakfast?" "Mom, it's important," Jonathan protested. "They found the medical examiner dead at the morgue last night. They're saying it looks like." "That's enough." Barbara's voice cracked slightly. She set down a plate of slightly charred toast with more force than necessary. "I don't want to hear another word about that business from last year. This town needs to heal." Sienna picked at her toast, her appetite vanishing as Jonathan's words sank in. The morgue. Last night, the same night she'd dreamed of. "Sienna, honey?" Her mother's voice softened. "Are you feeling all right? You look pale." "I'm fine," she lied, standing abruptly. "I should get to school. Meeting Allie early to work on our Halloween Carnival committee stuff." Barbara's face tightened at the mention of Halloween, but she forced a smile. "Just be careful, okay? Both of you. I know it's Halloween season, but with what happened at the morgue." "Nothing happened at the morgue," Jonathan interrupted, having recovered his phone. "They're saying the security cameras all went dead. Just static. And get this, they found rubber chicken, but its head was—" "I said enough." Barbara slammed her coffee mug down, dark liquid sloshing over the rim. "Go get ready for school, now." As Sienna gathered her backpack, she caught Jonathan slipping something into his pocket. A cheap Halloween mask with a white face and black features. Her stomach lurched. "John?" she whispered, catching his arm. "Where did you get that?" He shrugged. "Found it on my windowsill this morning. Cool, right? Like the one from those murders last." Sienna ripped the mask from his grasp and threw it in the kitchen trash, ignoring his protests. Outside, Allie's car horn honked twice. "Don't be late tonight," Barbara called after them. "And Sienna? Your father's old studio. I know you've been going there. Maybe take a break from that for a while?" Sienna nodded, but her mother's words only cemented her plans. The studio was where her father had spent his final days working on the warrior costume, growing increasingly paranoid and rambling about ancient evils and cosmic balance. At the time, they'd attributed it to his declining mental health. Now, as she slid into Allie's car, the morning news playing faintly on the radio about the morgue incident, Sienna wasn't so sure. The warrior costume, the dreams, the candy, Jonathan's mask, it all felt connected, like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite see. "Earth to Sienna." Allie waved a hand in front of her face. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Or, she lowered her voice dramatically, "A killer clown?" Sienna forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow even to her own ears. As they pulled away from the curb, she could have sworn she saw a flash of black and white in her bedroom window, just for a moment, like a face pressed against the glass. But when she looked again, there was nothing there but the morning sun reflecting off the warrior costume, its metal accents gleaming like warning beacons in the autumn light. Chapter 3. The Little Pale Girl. The halls of Miles County High School buzzed with Halloween excitement, but Sienna could barely focus on Allie's chatter about costume plans and party preparations. Her mind kept drifting back to the morning's news report playing in Allie's car. Third suspicious death this week. Authorities refused to comment on possible connections to last year's Halloween killings. "Sienna." Allie snapped her fingers. "Seriously, what is up with you today? You haven't heard a word I've said about Jeff's party." Before Sienna could respond, a flash of movement at the end of the hallway caught her eye. Through the crowd of students, she glimpsed a small figure, a girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, wearing a pristine white dress that seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights. The girl's skin was impossibly pale, her dark eyes fixed directly on Sienna. "Do you see her?" Sienna grabbed Allie's arm. "That little girl?" "What little girl?" Allie followed her gaze, but the figure had vanished. "Okay, you're officially freaking me out. First you zone out all morning, and now you're seeing ghost children?" The bell rang, sending students scurrying to class. As Sienna turned to her locker, a chill ran down her spine. There, stuck between the vents, was a crude crayon drawing. It showed a clown and a little girl in white holding hands, standing over what appeared to be... Sienna ripped the paper down, crumpling it in her fist. "What's that?" Allie tried to grab the drawing, but Sienna shoved it deep into her pocket. "Nothing. Just trash." She slammed her locker shut. "I need to skip first period. There's something I have to check at my dad's studio." "Now? Are you crazy? We have a test in." But Sienna was already moving, pushing through the crowd toward the exit. Behind her, she thought she heard a child's giggle echo through the hallway. The autumn air bit at her face as she jogged the familiar route to her father's art studio. The small building sat at the edge of an industrial park, largely abandoned since his death. As she approached, she noticed fresh graffiti on the outer wall, a crude smile in black paint. Her hands shook as she unlocked the door. Inside, dust motes danced in the streams of light filtering through the high windows. Her father's workbench stood exactly as he'd left it, sketches and tools scattered across its surface. The warrior costume he'd been working on at home had a twin here, an earlier prototype, hanging like a sentinel in the corner. Sienna approached her father's desk, drawn to his leather-bound sketchbook. She'd looked through it dozens of times since his death, trying to understand his final days, but something felt different now. The pages seemed to fall open naturally to a sketch she'd somehow never noticed before. The drawing showed the same little girl from the hallway, rendered in her father's precise style. Notes crowded the margins. "The herald always precedes him. Ancient evil wearing a modern mask. The cycle begins again." A floorboard creaked behind her. Sienna whirled around. There in the shadows stood the little girl from school, her white dress somehow untouched by the studio's dust. Up close, Sienna could see that the girl's skin wasn't just pale, it was almost translucent, with dark veins visible beneath. "He's been waiting for you," the girl said, her voice like ice cracking. "Your father tried to stop it, but he only made things worse. Now you have to play your part." "Who are you?" Sienna backed against the desk. "What do you want?" The girl's face split into a smile that was decidedly wrong. "Too wide, too many teeth. I'm the beginning of the show. I'm the first act." She giggled, the sound like breaking glass. "And he wanted me to give you this." She extended her small hand, holding another piece of black and white striped candy. Sienna blinked, and the girl was gone. Only the candy remained, sitting innocently on the floor where she had stood. With trembling fingers, Sienna turned back to her father's sketchbook. The pages now showed something new, or perhaps something she'd been too afraid to see before. Dozens of drawings of Art the Clown, each more detailed and disturbing than the last. And between the sketches, her father's frantic handwriting. "The costume is the key. The warrior must rise. My daughter, forgive me for what I've started." Behind her, a child's laughter echoed once more, but this time it was joined by another sound, the silent, wheezing laugh of a clown. When Sienna spun around again, she was alone in the studio. But on her father's workbench, where there had only been dust moments before, sat a rubber chicken, its head twisted completely backward. Chapter 4. The Halloween Store. The Halloween Heaven sign flickered erratically above the strip mall storefront, casting intermittent red light across the nearly empty parking lot. Jonathan Shaw stood before the display window, mesmerized by a particular clown mask that seemed to stare right back at him. He ditched his last period class for this. The store had just gotten a new shipment of Halloween merchandise, and after Sienna had thrown away his other mask, he needed a replacement. The bell above the door chimed as he entered. Jerry, the aging store owner, barely looked up from his magazine. "Shop's closing in 30 minutes, kid." Jonathan made his way through the aisles, past rubber spiders and synthetic cobwebs. The store smelled of latex and cheap plastic, with Monster Mash playing faintly through crackling speakers. He found the mask section at the back, but the clown mask from the window wasn't there. Looking for something specific? Jonathan jumped. He hadn't heard anyone approach, but there he was. A tall figure in a black and white clown costume, complete with face paint and a small black nose. For a moment, Jonathan's heart stopped. But no, this had to be a store employee in costume. Had to be. The clown tilted his head questioningly, then held up the exact mask Jonathan had been looking for. That's it. Jonathan reached for it, but the clown playfully pulled it away, waggling his finger. He pointed to the other end of the aisle, then skipped away with exaggerated movements, clearly wanting Jonathan to follow. Hey, wait! Jonathan hurried after him. The store's fluorescent lights seemed to flicker in their wake, shadows growing longer. How much is it? The clown rounded a corner into the prop weapons aisle. When Jonathan followed, he found him examining a plastic sword with theatrical interest. The mask now sat atop a nearby shelf. Cool sword, Jonathan said, trying to mask his unease. The clown's movements were odd, too precise, like a spider wearing human skin. You work here long? Art, and Jonathan was beginning to suspect that's exactly who this was, made a show of testing the sword's weight. Then, with a silent laugh, he snapped it in half with unnatural strength. The sharp crack echoed through the store. Hey! Jerry's voice called from the front. Everything okay back there? The clown pressed a finger to his lips, then reached into his pocket and withdrew something that definitely wasn't plastic, a gleaming metal straight razor. He offered it to Jonathan, handle first, his painted smile never wavering. Jonathan's feet felt frozen to the floor. Every story he'd read about last year's massacres, every crime scene photo he'd secretly studied, every detail about Art the Clown flashed through his mind. He should run. He should scream. He should. He reached for the razor. The store lights went out. In the darkness, he heard Jerry curse from the front, followed by approaching footsteps. Damn fuse box again. Hold on, I got a flashlight. A match flared to life inches from Jonathan's face, illuminating Art's grin. The clown was now holding the razor himself, its edge catching the matchlight. With his free hand, he offered Jonathan the clown mask once more. The beam of Jerry's flashlight swept the aisle. Anyone still back here? Jonathan stood alone in the darkness. The mask lay at his feet, along with the broken sword and a small pool of something dark that definitely wasn't prop blood. On the shelf behind him, someone had written in fresh crimson, "Try it on." His hands trembling, Jonathan picked up the mask. Through its eye holes, he could have sworn he saw movement in the darkness, a small figure in white, watching him with black eyes. The light sputtered back to life. "Store's closing," Jerry called. "Bring your stuff up front." Jonathan clutched the mask to his chest, his heart pounding. As he walked to the register, he felt different somehow, like he'd just passed some sort of test, or maybe failed one. Just this. Jerry rang up the mask, not noticing the dark stains on its edges. You know, funny thing, guy came in earlier wanting to sell us a bunch of clown stuff. Real vintage pieces, but kinda creepy. Had to turn him down. Speaking of which, did you see anyone else back there? Thought I heard. But Jonathan was already pushing through the door, the bell's chime drowned out by the sound of his own pulse in his ears. In the reflection of his phone screen, he checked his appearance. For a moment, just a moment, his face looked different. Painted, smiling. Behind him, in the store window, the display mask had changed position. It now faced the street, its empty eyes following him as he walked away. And beneath it, barely visible in the gathering dusk, a fresh handprint pressed against the glass. Not a child's, not an adult's, but something in between. The little pale girl had been watching too. In his pocket, Jonathan's fingers closed around something he didn't remember picking up. A small piece of candy wrapped in black and white striped paper. Chapter 5. Carnival of Horrors. The Miles County Halloween Carnival transformed the old fairgrounds into a maze of colored lights and shadows. Carnival music drifted through the autumn air, mixing with the screams from the haunted house and the laughter of children. Sienna stood at the entrance, adjusting her warrior costume one last time. "You look amazing," Allie squealed, snapping pictures with her phone. "I can't believe your dad made this. The detail is incredible." She herself was dressed as a vampire, fake blood gleaming at the corners of her mouth. Sienna ran her hand over the intricately worked leather and metal. The costume felt warm against her skin, almost alive. Her father's last words from his journal echoed in her mind. The warrior must rise. Has anyone seen Jonathan? Barbara's worried voice cut through her thoughts. Her mother had insisted on chaperoning, still anxious about the recent deaths. He said he was meeting friends, Sienna replied, scanning the crowd. Something felt off about the carnival tonight. The shadows seemed too deep, the lights too harsh. Let's hit the haunted house! Allie grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the largest attraction. A sign proclaimed, Terror Under the Big Top, new for 2024. As they approached, Sienna froze. There, by the entrance, stood a familiar small figure in a white dress. The little pale girl, Sienna whispered. What? Allie followed her gaze. Oh yeah. Creepy kid. Great costume, though. The girl turned to face them, her dark eyes fixing on Sienna. She raised one pale finger to her lips, then pointed toward the funhouse mirrors nearby. There, reflected in the warped glass, Sienna caught a glimpse of something that made her blood run cold. A tall, black and white figure, moving against the flow of the reflections. Allie, we need to find Jonathan. Now. But Allie was already buying tickets from the haunted house attendant, a thin man in elaborate clown makeup who seemed oddly familiar with the process despite being new staff. Inside the haunted house, the carnival sounds became muffled. Black lights made their costumes glow as they moved through the twisted corridors. Mechanical props jumped out, drawing screams from the guests ahead of them. Wait, Sienna grabbed Allie's arm. These props, look at them. The typical Halloween decorations had been replaced. Each scene they passed showed increasingly disturbing tableaus of clown-related violence, far too realistic for a family carnival. In one corner, a rubber chicken sat in a pool of what didn't look like fake blood. Okay, this is messed up, Allie admitted. Let's get out of. The lights went out. In the darkness, someone giggled. Not the little pale girl this time, but something trying to sound like her. When the emergency lights sputtered on, they were bathed in red. They weren't alone in the corridor. Art the clown stood at the far end, his black and white face paint stark against the red light. He held something in his hands, Jonathan's phone, playing one of the crime scene videos he'd been obsessed with. Run! Sienna shoved Allie toward the exit sign. Behind them, Art's silent laugh followed, along with the sound of something sharp being dragged along the wall. They burst into a mirror maze. Countless reflections of Art appeared and disappeared as they ran, some moving in impossible ways. In every other reflection, the little pale danced just out of sight. The exit. Allie pointed to a glowing sign, but as they approached, they realized their mistake. The sign now read, No Exit, in dripping red letters. A scream cut through the carnival music, not from their haunted house, but from the fairgrounds outside. Then another. And another. He's not alone, Sienna realized. This whole carnival, it's all part of his show. Through the mirrors, they watched in horror as Art produced his straight razor, testing its edge with theatrical precision. Next to him, the little pale girl appeared, holding Jonathan's clown mask. Where's my brother? Sienna's voice shook. What have you done with him? The little pale girl smiled her too wide smile. He's becoming part of the show, she said in her glass-breaking voice. Just like everyone else here tonight. Art began to advance, his movements jerky and unnatural. In every mirror, he moved differently, making it impossible to tell which was the real threat. Suddenly, Sienna's costume began to warm against her skin. The metal accents gleamed with an inner light, and she heard her father's voice in her head. The warrior must rise. She grabbed a broken piece of mirror, holding it like a weapon. The reflection showed her costume glowing with otherworldly energy, and for a moment, she saw what her father had been trying to create. Not just armor, but something ancient and powerful. Art paused, tilting his head curiously. The little pale girl's smile faltered. Outside, the carnival descended into chaos as more of Art's performers emerged from the shadows. Barbara's voice could be heard calling for Jonathan over the growing screams. In the mirror maze, Sienna stood her ground, the warrior costume humming with power. She faced the clown who had haunted her dreams, who had taken her father, who now threatened everything she loved. Let's end this show, she said. Art's grin widened impossibly as he raised his razor. The real performance was about to begin. Chapter 6. The Clown Cafe. The abandoned Terrifier funhouse loomed at the edge of town, its faded sign now reimagined with fresh paint. Clown Cafe in dripping letters. Detective Travis Bryan stood in the parking lot, watching as forensics documented bloody handprints on the entrance, some large, some impossibly small. "Third crime scene this week," his partner muttered, handing him a coffee. "And they're getting worse." Inside, the old family restaurant had been transformed into something from a nightmare. The booths were occupied by mannequins in clown costumes, their faces carved into permanent grins. Half-eaten meals sat before them, still warm despite the building having been abandoned for years. "Detective," a young officer called from the kitchen. "You need to see this." Travis steeled himself before pushing through the swinging doors. The industrial kitchen had become Art's playground. The walls were covered in photographs, surveillance shots of Sienna Shaw, her brother Jonathan, their mother Barbara. Each photo was defaced with crude clown makeup drawn in what looked disturbingly like blood. "Sir," the officer pointed to the walk-in freezer. "There's something inside, something moving." Travis drew his weapon and approached. Through the frosted glass, a small figure was visible. A girl in white, pressing her hands against the door. "Miles County PD, step back from the door." He yanked it open, but the freezer was empty. Only a single black and white striped candy sat in the center of the floor, surrounded by frost patterns that seemed to form laughing faces. A giggle echoed through the kitchen. "Hello?" A child's voice called from the dining room. "Is someone there? I can't find my mommy." Travis rushed back through the doors, gun raised. In one of the booths sat the little pale girl, her white dress pristine despite the grime around her. She was coloring something with crayons. "It's okay." Travis lowered his weapon slightly. "We're the police. We'll help you find." "Oh, I already found her." The girl looked up, her smile too wide, her teeth too sharp. "Art's showing her the special menu right now. Would you like to see my drawing?" She held up the paper. It showed crude stick figures of everyone in the building. The forensics team, the officers, Travis himself. Each figure had been given a clown face, and above them loomed a larger figure with a familiar black and white visage. The lights went out. In the darkness, Travis heard his team screaming, their voices cutting off one by one. Emergency lights sputtered on, bathing everything in red. The little pale girl was gone, but her drawing remained, the figures now crossed out in wet red crayon. Through the window, Travis watched in horror as Art the Clown emerged from behind the counter, his movements jerky and unnatural. He carried his signature black bag, now dripping something dark onto the checkered floor. "Fall back!" Travis shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the sudden blast of Carnival music from ancient speakers. The mannequins in the booths began to move, their carved smiles cracking wider as they turned their heads to watch. Art reached into his bag and withdrew something that made Travis's blood run cold. Jonathan Shaw's clown mask, now stained with something that definitely wasn't stage makeup. "Where's the boy?" Travis demanded, his gun trained on Art's painted face. "What have you done with him?" Art's silent laugh shook his shoulders as he reached back into the bag. He pulled out a phone, Jonathan's, and pressed play. The screen showed footage from the Halloween Carnival, but not from last year. This was live. Through the phone, Travis watched as chaos unfolded at the carnival grounds. Multiple figures in clown masks moved through the crowds, led by what appeared to be a young boy wearing a mask identical to the one Art held. Jonathan Shaw, now part of the performance. "This is Detective Bryan." Travis grabbed his radio. "I need all units to the Halloween Carnival. Multiple suspects, possible hostage situation." The radio crackled with static, then began to play carnival music. Art's grin widened impossibly as he produced his straight razor. Behind him, the little pale girl reappeared, holding hands with what looked like a mannequin, but moved like a person. Another victim, Travis realized, transformed into part of Art's growing collection. "Get out!" Travis fired, the shots echoing through the cafe. But Art only stumbled theatrically, his movements becoming more spider-like with each impact. The bullets seemed to pass through him, leaving only puffs of white powder like theatrical makeup. In the red emergency lights, Travis saw more figures emerging from the shadows, former victims, now twisted into grotesque performers in Art's eternal show. And among them, Still clutching her crayons, the little pale girl began to sing a nursery rhyme in her broken glass voice. The clown came down to Miles County to steal some souls to keep. Now everyone's part of his party, and no one gets to sleep. Art raised his razor in a conductor's gesture, and his macabre orchestra began to move. The last thing Detective Brian saw before the emergency lights failed was his own reflection in a greasy window, his face now painted in black and white, his mouth stretched into an impossible grin. The show at the Clown Cafe was about to begin. Chapter 7, Family Secrets. The chaos at the carnival still echoed in Sienna's ears as she and Allie barricaded themselves inside her father's art studio. The warrior costume hummed against her skin, its metal accents giving off a faint blue glow in the darkness. "What is happening?" Allie's hands shook as she helped Sienna push a heavy workbench against the door. "Those people at the carnival? They were like puppets. And Jonathan? Don't." Sienna cut her off. She couldn't think about how her brother had looked, wearing that mask, moving with jerky motions as he led other masked figures through the screaming crowds. "We need to find my dad's journal. There's more to this costume, more to everything than he told us." The studio looked different in the night. Moonlight filtered through the high windows, casting strange shadows across her father's work. Drawings and sketches covered the walls, but now Sienna could see what she'd been missing. They weren't just artwork. They were warnings. "Look at this." Allie pointed to a series of sketches. They showed Art the Clown through different eras: Victorian England, medieval Europe, ancient Rome. Always the same painted face, always the same terrible grin. "Your dad was tracking him?" Sienna pulled open her father's locked drawer, using the key she'd found hidden in the warrior costume's armor. Inside lay a leather-bound journal she'd never seen before, its pages filled with frantic writing and detailed diagrams. "He is not a man," Sienna read aloud, "but an entity that feeds on fear and corruption. The clown is merely his current face, chosen for this era's particular fears. The little pale girl is his herald, preparing the way. Each time he returns, he must claim a certain number of souls before he can fully manifest. Each victim becomes part of his performance, trapped in an eternal carnival of horrors." A child's giggle echoed through the studio. "Hello, warrior." The little pale girl stepped from behind a canvas, her white dress glowing softly. "Your father was very clever. He almost figured it all out. Would you like to see what happened when he did?" She held out her small hand. In it was a piece of black and white striped candy, but this one was old, faded, covered in dust. "No," Sienna breathed, understanding dawning. "Dad didn't die from suicide, did he?" The little pale girl's smile widened. He was Art's first victim in this cycle, but he'd already prepared for that possibility. The costume wasn't finished, but he put everything he had learned into it. Old magic, forgotten symbols, protection spells hidden in the designs. "Magic?" Allie scoffed. "This is crazy." "Look at your phone," the little pale girl interrupted. Allie pulled out her phone. The screen showed live footage from the carnival. Jonathan stood center frame, his clown mask now seemed fused to his face. Behind him, dozens of carnival goers now wore similar masks, moving in unison like a grotesque dance troupe. Art stood among them, a ringmaster conducting his growing orchestra of horror. "Your brother was so easy to turn," the little pale girl said. "He wanted so badly to understand art, to be part of the show. But you," she looked at Sienna with her dark eyes, "you're different. Your father made sure of that." Sienna turned back to the journal, flipping through pages frantically. Diagrams of the warrior costume showed layers of symbols and sigils worked into every piece. Notes in her father's handwriting explained their purpose: protection from corruption, resistance to Art's influence, power against the dark. The costume's not finished, Sienna realized, seeing the final pages. There are pieces missing, pieces he didn't have time to add before. A loud bang cut her off. Something heavy hit the studio door, making the barricade shudder. "That'll be Art," the little pale girl said cheerfully. "He's very interested in your father's work, especially since the costume seems to be the only thing that's ever hurt him." Another bang. The workbench scraped against the floor. Sienna looked down at the costume she wore, seeing it with new eyes. The metal wasn't just decorative, it formed patterns, symbols, a language of protection she was only beginning to understand. "We need to get to the carnival," she said. "We have to stop this before Jonathan and the others are fully transformed." "Oh, it's far too late for that," the little pale girl laughed. "The show is already in its final act, but if you insist on trying—" She pointed to a covered canvas in the corner. Sienna pulled off the sheet to reveal her father's final painting, a detailed map of the carnival grounds, covered in the same symbols that adorned her costume. In the center of the map, beneath the main tent, her father had painted an ancient door covered in clown faces, with a note scrawled beside it: "His true entrance to our world must be sealed." The studio door burst open. Art the clown stepped through the splintered remains of the barricade, his painted face somehow more terrible in the moonlight. His black bag dripped dark fluid onto the floor, and in his hand he held the straight razor that had claimed so many victims. But when he saw Sienna in the warrior costume, he paused. For the first time, his eternal grin faltered. The little pale girl's laughter echoed through the studio. Now the real show can begin. The costume blazed with blue light as Sienna faced her father's killer. In her hands, she clutched the journal, the key to finishing what her father had started. Behind her, Allie grabbed a paint-stained sword from the wall. Not a prop, but something far older that had been disguised as part of the studio's decor. Art's grin returned as he raised his razor. The final battle for Miles County was about to begin. Chapter 8: The Hospital Horror. Miles County Hospital's emergency room was in chaos. Victims from the carnival filled every available space, many still wearing torn costume pieces, others clutching carnival prizes now stained with blood. Barbara Shaw paced the waiting room, her phone pressed to her ear as she tried again to reach Jonathan. "Mrs. Shaw?" A nurse approached, clipboard in hand. "We need to talk about what you saw at the carnival." Barbara's hands trembled. "My son, he was wearing that mask, but it wasn't him. The way he moved, and those other people following him." The fluorescent lights flickered, and for a moment, the nurse's face seemed to shift, revealing traces of white grease paint underneath her skin. Down in the morgue, Detective Brian's body lay covered on a steel table, though the sheet couldn't hide his final expression. That terrible, forced grin. Two orderlies wheeled in another victim from the carnival, their shoes leaving red prints on the white floor. "Did you hear?" one whispered. "They're saying some of the victims were laughing while they died." The other orderly started to respond, but stopped short. Through the morgue's small window, a pale face peered in, a little girl in white, pressing her hands against the glass. Up in the pediatric ward, children gathered at their windows, pointing at the carnival lights visible in the distance. Each of them held a piece of black and white striped candy, though none could remember where they got it. Sienna burst through the ER doors, supported by Allie. Her warrior costume was scratched and dented from her confrontation with Art at the studio, but the symbols still glowed with faint power. "We need help," Allie called out. But as staff approached, Sienna grabbed her arm. "Wait," she whispered. "Look at their eyes." Each person in the ER had the same glazed expression, and beneath their surgical masks, hints of black and white paint were visible at the edges. "He's already been here," Sienna realized. "The hospital, it's becoming part of his show." From somewhere deep in the building, carnival music began to play through the PA system. "Attention all staff," a child's voice giggled over the speakers. "The circus is now beginning on all floors. Please report to your designated positions." The hospital staff moved in unison, their movements becoming jerky and theatrical. Patients rose from their beds, IV stands dragging behind them like grotesque puppet strings. "Mom!" Sienna spotted Barbara near the nurse's station. "We have to get out of here." But Barbara turned slowly, revealing a face now painted in perfect black and white. "But honey," she said in a voice that wasn't quite her own. "Don't you want to be part of the show? Your brother is having so much fun." The emergency lights kicked in, bathing everything in red. Art the clown stepped out of the elevator, his black bag now large enough to hold something human-sized. The little pale girl skipped beside him, leaving bloody footprints with each step. "The hospital was always his real target," Sienna said, understanding dawning as she read more from her father's journal. "That's why he let us escape the studio. A carnival is temporary, but a hospital... People are already afraid here, already vulnerable." Very good. The little pale girl clapped her hands. Your father figured that out too, right before he volunteered for Art's first performance. Medical equipment began to screech and wail, their normal beeping transformed into a demented carnival orchestra. Nurses and doctors moved through the halls like mechanical dolls, drawing blood samples with exaggerated flourishes, administering medication with theatrical gestures. The costume, Allie pointed to Sienna's armor. The symbols are glowing brighter. Sienna looked down. The protective sigils her father had crafted were pulsing with blue light, pushing back the shadows that crept along the walls. But in their light, she could see the truth of what the hospital had become. Every reflective surface, windows, mirrors, chrome fixtures, showed the building's transformation. The hospital corridors had become twisted carnival tunnels, the rooms warped into circus tents, and the patients, their hospital gowns had turned to circus costumes, their medical equipment into props for an eternal performance. Art raised his razor in a conductor's gesture. Around him, hospital staff began to dance, their movements a mockery of medical procedures. Barbara joined them, her steps perfectly synchronized to the carnival music that grew louder with each passing second. Your father's costume can't save everyone, the little pale girl said, her dark eyes fixed on Sienna. Art's influence is too strong now, but maybe you can still save one person. She pointed to a security monitor. On the screen, Jonathan stood in the hospital chapel, still wearing his clown mask. But something was different. He seemed to be fighting against the mask's control, his movements jerky and resistant. The bond between siblings, the little pale girl mused. Sometimes it's stronger than Art's call. But you'll have to choose. Try to save your brother, or try to stop Art from claiming the entire hospital. Sienna clutched her father's journal tighter, looking from the monitor to the growing chaos around her. The costume's power hummed against her skin, responding to her determination. Allie, she said, I need you to find the hospital's basement. Dad's map showed something about convergence points where Art's power is strongest. If we can't stop him here, the whole town will become his carnival, Allie finished. Above them, the PA system crackled again. This time it was Jonathan's voice, but distorted, singing a broken version of a circus theme. Come one, come all, to the greatest show, where every scream becomes part of the flow. Art's carnival is coming to town, where everyone wears the face of a clown. The little pale girl began to skip down the hall, leaving bloody footprints that formed circus shapes. Better hurry, she called back. The final act is about to begin, and your brother's mask isn't the only one that's becoming permanent. Art's silent laugh echoed through the hospital as Sienna made her choice. The warrior costume blazed with protective light as she stepped forward, ready to face whatever horrors awaited in this medical maze turned circus of terror. The show was reaching its climax, and Miles County Hospital had become center stage. Chapter 9: Warriors Rise. The hospital chapel had become a funhouse mirror of sacred space, where stained glass windows once filtered sunlight, carnival colors now strobed in unholy patterns. Jonathan stood before the altar, his clown mask fused to his face, but his body trembled with inner resistance. John, Sienna called softly, her warrior costume casting that blue light through the twisted space. I know you're still in there. He turned, his movements jerky, fighting against invisible strings. The mask's painted grin seemed to pulse, trying to fully claim him. Sienna? Jonathan's voice cracked beneath the mask. I can't. He's in my head. The show. Everyone has to join the show. The little pale girl appeared in one of the pews, swinging her legs like a bored child at church. Oh, this is interesting. Most of them don't fight this hard. Must run in the family. Sienna opened her father's journal to the pages she'd discovered. Dad knew this might happen. The symbols on my costume, they're not just for protection. She stepped closer to Jonathan. They're for healing, for breaking Art's control. Careful, the little pale girl sang. Art doesn't like people leaving the show early. As if summoned by her words, the chapel doors burst open. Art the clown entered like a demented priest, his movements a mockery of religious ceremony. Behind him, Barbara and other converted hospital staff formed a twisted congregation, their faces painted in varying stages of transformation. Get away from him, Barbara spoke in multiple voices, her own mixed with something ancient and terrible. The boy belongs to the show now. Sienna stood her ground between Art and her brother. The costume began to change, its metal components shifting and expanding. The symbols her father had crafted glowed brighter, forming patterns of light that pushed back the carnival corruption. "You're wrong," Sienna said, understanding flowing through her with the costume's power. "Dad didn't just make armor. He made a weapon, something that could fight back against all of this." Art's eternal grin faltered again. He reached into his bag, withdrawing not his razor but something older, a circus master's whip that seemed to be made of living shadows. "The costume's not complete," the little pale girl called out, her voice sharp with worry. "Your father never finished the final pieces." "No," Sienna smiled, "but he left me everything I need to finish it." She pressed her hand to the journal's final page, where her father had drawn the last symbol in his own blood. The ink seemed to flow off the page, wrapping around her armor in streams of light. The warrior costume transformed, completing itself according to her father's final design. Jonathan screamed behind his mask as Art cracked his shadow whip. But where the darkness struck Sienna's armor, it shattered into sparks of light. "I understand now," Sienna said, advancing on Art. "You're not just a clown. You're fear itself, wearing the face of whatever scares us most. But my father found something stronger than fear." The little pale girl stood, her dark eyes wide. No, he couldn't have. Love, Sienna reached for her brother. A father's love for his children, a sister's love for her brother. That's what he built into every piece of this costume. And that's what's going to end your show. Art's movements became more frantic, less controlled. He lashed out with the whip again and again, but each strike was met with bursts of protective light. The hospital staff congregation began to twitch and shake, Art's control wavering. Sienna pressed her armored hand to Jonathan's mask. Light poured from the symbols, seeping beneath the cursed costume piece. Jonathan screamed, but this time it was the sound of breaking free. The mask cracked. "No." The little pale girl's voice shattered windows. "Art, stop her. The show can't end." But Sienna was already pulling the fragments of mask away from her brother's face, revealing his true features beneath. Jonathan gasped like a drowning man finding air, his eyes clearing. Art's whip dissolved into smoke. He reached for his razor, but found his bag transforming, spilling out not blood but stage makeup and torn circus props, his illusions weakening under the costume's light. "Dad's last message," Sienna read from the journal's final page, her voice growing stronger. "To seal away the eternal carnival, to end the show forever, a warrior must rise, wearing armor forged from love and sacrifice." The chapel's carnival lights flickered and died, leaving only the blue glow of Sienna's completed costume. Around them, hospital staff members began to collapse as Art's paint ran from their faces like tears. Barbara dropped to her knees, the clown makeup melting away. "My children, what have I?" But there was no time for reunion. Art's form began to shift and grow, his clown aspect falling away to reveal something darker, older. The little pale girl's laughter turned to screams as her pristine dress blackened at the edges. "The final act," Jonathan whispered, clutching his sister's armored hand. "Sienna, the real show is just beginning." Art towered over them now, his true form emerging. A writhing mass of shadows and teeth, wearing 1,000 years of humanity's nightmares like a crown. The eternal carnival's master was revealed at last. Sienna raised her armored hands, her father's final gift blazing with protective light. The warrior had risen. The battle for Miles County's soul was about to begin. Chapter 10. Final Confrontation. Miles County Hospital warped and twisted, its walls stretching into a massive big top as Art's true form emerged. The creature that had worn the clown's face towered above them, a writhing mass of ancient nightmares. Each of its countless eyes held a different version of itself through history. The clown was just its latest mask. "This is what Dad saw," Jonathan whispered, still weak from breaking the mask's control. "This is what drove him to create the armor." Sienna stood before the monster, her completed warrior costume blazing with protective light. The symbols her father had crafted pulsed in response to Art's darkness, creating a barrier between the creature and what remained of the human world. The little pale girl's form flickered between her innocent appearance and something far older, a herald of chaos that had announced Art's arrival throughout history. "You can't stop the show," she hissed, her voice cracking like breaking glass. "The carnival is eternal. Fear is eternal." "Maybe," Sienna answered, raising her armored hands, "but so is hope. So is love. That's what Dad discovered." Art's massive form rippled, and from its shadowy mass emerged every victim it had claimed in Miles County. Detective Brian, the hospital staff, carnival goers, all dancing in a macabre performance. Their painted faces bore expressions of eternal agony. Barbara struggled to her feet, the last traces of clown makeup falling away. "Sienna, the journal. Your father's last notes." Sienna opened the blood-inked pages to her father's final entry. "The eternal carnival draws power from our fear, our despair. But there's a price to maintaining its connection to our world. Points of convergence, anchors, the door beneath the big top." Understanding dawned. "The hospital chapel wasn't random," she said. "It's built on one of the anchor points. That's why you brought your show here, isn't it?" Art's enormous form shuddered. The little pale girl screamed, "Stop her." The possessed victims lurched forward, but Sienna's armor flared brighter. The protective symbols created a circle of light, pushing back the carnival's corruption. Within that circle, Jonathan and Barbara huddled close, their family bond strengthening the costume's power. "Ally," Sienna called out. "The basement. Did you find it?" Her friend's voice crackled through a discarded hospital radio. "Yes, there's something down here, like a door, but wrong. It's covered in faces, all laughing." "Dad's map showed 3 points," Sienna read from the journal. "The hospital, the carnival grounds, and the studio," Jonathan finished. "Dad's studio. That's why Art kept returning there." Art's massive form began to split and divide, trying to maintain its hold on all 3 locations at once. The little pale girl's form similarly fractured, her laughter echoing from multiple directions. "You'll have to choose," the herald taunted. "Save your friend in the basement, your brother, your mother, or stop Art from claiming his final sacrifices. The show demands an ending." But Sienna stood firm, her father's last gift humming with power. "You're right. It does end tonight, but not the way you planned." She pressed her armored hand to the chapel floor, and the symbols from her costume began to spread, creating a network of light that raced through the hospital's foundations. Through her connection to the armor, she could feel Ally doing something similar in the basement, using the journal's copied pages to activate ancient wards. Art's true form roared in silent fury as its anchors began to weaken. The little pale girl's fragments rushed back together as she felt her master's grip on reality slipping. "The costume isn't just armor," Sienna declared, her voice carrying the weight of her father's discovery. "It's a key and a lock." The light from her armor intensified, connecting with the symbols spreading through the building. Similar light burst from the carnival grounds and her father's studio. 3 points of a triangle, sealing something that should never have been unleashed. Art's massive form thrashed as the trap began to close. Its victims dropped one by one, the clown makeup dissolving, leaving them unconscious but free. The little pale girl's ageless face contorted with rage. "You can't end the show," she shrieked. "Fear is eternal. The carnival must go on." "Fear might be eternal," Sienna agreed, raising her hands as the costume's power reached its peak. "But so is courage. So is love. So is family." She looked at Jonathan and Barbara, drawing strength from their presence. In the basement, Allie continued her part of the ritual. Across town, the symbols at her father's studio blazed to life one final time. "The warrior rises," Sienna read the last words her father had written, "not to destroy fear, but to remind us that we can face it together." Art's form began to collapse in on itself, drawn back toward the ancient door that had allowed it access to our world. The little pale girl screamed as she was pulled into the vortex, her white dress shredding to reveal the countless dark forms she had worn throughout history. The hospital shuddered as reality reasserted itself. The carnival lights flickered and died. The painted faces of Art's victims faded, leaving only exhausted but human features behind. In the final moments, as Art's true form was dragged back through the closing door, its clown face reformed one last time. That eternal grin looked at Sienna with something almost like respect before it too was pulled away. The door sealed with a sound like thunder. Then silence. Sienna's armor dimmed but didn't fade completely, its symbols now a permanent part of her. Around them, the hospital slowly returned to normal. The victims began to stir, free from Art's influence. Is it? Jonathan struggled to his feet. Is it over? Sienna helped her mother up, the three of them holding each other tight. The door is sealed. Dad's work is complete. But... She looked down at her armor, still humming faintly with power. But what? Barbara asked. Dad's last note, Sienna said quietly. About the warrior rising? I don't think it was just about tonight. Art isn't the only darkness out there. Maybe that's why the costume is still active. So you're what? Jonathan managed a weak smile. Some kind of supernatural protector now? Sienna looked at her reflection in a nearby window. The warrior costume had become part of her, its symbols reflecting both her father's sacrifice and her own transformation. I'm whatever I need to be, she said. Whatever stands between the light and the dark, between hope and fear. In the distance, sirens wailed as emergency services responded to the chaos at the Carnival grounds. The sun was rising, painting Miles County in colors that had nothing to do with Carnival lights. But in the deepest basement of the hospital, in the Carnival's forgotten spaces, in the shadows of her father's studio, a faint echo of circus music could still be heard. And if you listened closely, beneath the fading melody, someone was laughing. The show might have ended. But darkness is patient, and clowns never die. They just wait for the next performance to begin. The end.